I am Claire Lee Brown, Associate Professor in ESL Education at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And I'm very honored to be the person to present Dr. Stephen Krashen. So this morning I was very, very excited. I showed up 2 hours before this session, this plenary speaking engagement, at the Presenter's Lounge. So one of the young ladies asked me if I'm his personal assistant. So I thought, I considered him as my mentor, but not that way. And I said, I don't think he can afford me because I'm very expensive. I charge like $30 an hour. So here you are. And again, I'm very honored to present Dr. Stephen Krashen to you. Today, Dr. Stephen Krashen is Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Southern California. He's the most influential theoretician and scholar in the field of second language acquisition. Krashen's second language acquisition theory provides an important theoretical framework for English as second language and bilingual education teachers and their classroom practice. He also connects reading as a causative factor for acquiring a second language. He's the author of more than 350 articles when I checked last time, and numerous books in the fields of bilingual education and neurolinguistics and second language acquisition and literacy. He is also a recipient of numerous prestigious awards. He has been one of the staunchest advocates and defenders of bilingual education. For the last 30 years, he has devoted his time tirelessly to bettering the education for all children, especially those of cultural and linguistic minorities and children of poverty. His most recent books include The Power of Reading, 2nd edition, Explorations in Language Acquisition and Use, the Taipei Lectures, Foreign Language Acquisition, the Easy Way, Under Attack, the Case Against Bilingual Education, and Condemned Without a Trial, Bogus Arguments Against Bilingual Education. And also, I'd like you to know that he holds a black belt in Taekwondo, and one time he was incline bench press champion once, and he's also very proud grandpa of wonderful grandchildren. And also, do you know he's an accomplished pianist? And I think he secretly let her play piano in the Nordstrom department store. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me present to you Dr. Stephen Krashen.
How do I know when my time is up? Anyone have a watch? Will you signal me? Signal me at 40 minutes, okay? Actually, I wanted to go 3-4 hours, and I thought we could, order pizza, just like Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Let me discuss the beautiful introduction. I have to explain the Taekwondo stuff. Yeah, it's true. I did get a black belt in Taekwondo. But I have to tell you, I got it on the basis of the written examination. I was asked by the organizers if I wanted PowerPoint. I didn't know what PowerPoint was until about a year ago. I thought it was another martial art. I have a black belt in PowerPoint, watch out. And I don't know PowerPoint, but I've watched people use it, and I've noticed that 1 out of 4 times something doesn't work. Isn't that true? Okay. And I have this hypothesis about technology. Tell me if this matches your experience. By the time you master a new system, it's obsolete. I don't know how to turn my television set on and off anymore. It's just too complicated, okay? So I'm not doing PowerPoint. I have it the old-fashioned way. You should have handouts, right? That's the old-fashioned way. Also, today I want to explain the organization of my talk. Instead of giving one talk, I'm going to give 8 short talks. And I'll tell you when each one is done so you can burst into wild applause. This is my way of milking the audience for more applause. And I've decided short talks are better, and short papers are better. I'm on this campaign to get people to write shorter papers. We have our tradition from literature, and they're just too long. Thank you, that's great. Here's a quote for you. Here's a quote for you. Oh, thank you, Jiyoung Kim, for the call. Thank you so much. This is getting me through. I'll come back to this topic in a moment. There's a famous quote from a scientist of about 300 years ago. He said, when you ask someone the time, you don't want to lecture on how wristwatches are constructed. Okay? So I'm going to try to give 8 very short papers. I'll tell you when each one is up. Actually, I'm going to give 9 papers. I'm going to give you an opening paper that I hadn't planned to. But this is new research we have from the scientific laboratories in Southern California. And it has to do with a problem that's very close to me at my stage of life. And for most of you, it's going to be 40 years until you need this data. But I'll tell you now. I've been very concerned with aging. I don't know why, but lately I've been concerned about it. I'm older now than I've ever been. In fact, when Mozart was my age, he had been dead for 35 years. Okay. I'm very concerned about aging, and I'm also very concerned about dementia, senility, and losing your mental powers. Personally, and this is true, on my father's side of the family, the Krashen side of the family, there is a tendency toward dementia and borderline Alzheimer's. And it seems to happen, it happened to my dad and my aunts and uncles around the mid-70s. So I'm getting kind of close to that. So I've got to do something about it. So I started reading the research on dementia. And I actually wrote a paper about this, which I'll put on the website as soon as I can. I isolated 3 factors that can delay dementia, and you can do all 3. Number 1, bilingualism. Isn't that wonderful? People who are bilingual develop dementia several years later. Now, everyone has a mental decline with age, but bilingualism will slow down certain parts of it. It's something called executive control, and that's not getting distracted. For example, you get up in the morning and you're going to go downstairs to see what's in the newspaper, and on the way down, you realize there's a dish sitting out, you put that away, then there's a towel on the floor, you pick that up, and then you forgot why you came downstairs in the first place, okay? That happens to all of us, but as you get older, it gets more and more extreme. What was I talking about? Okay, so that's what I mean. Well, bilingualism, going back and forth between languages, lifetime bilingualism especially, reduces the effect. You're much better at executive control. Number 2, you see how this coordinates with the conference, reading. Not any kind of reading, not reading a passage and answering reading comprehension questions. No, free voluntary reading, pleasure reading. People my age who read a lot have the same verbal memory as people much younger who don't read. So bilingualism and reading. Number 3, are you ready for this? Coffee. Yes! I'm going to write a book called Rationalizations to Live By. Okay, because this is one of them. And this is what the studies say, no kidding. 3 cups a day. Now, I know this takes discipline, but you can do it. 3 cups a day appears to be optimal to slow down dementia and remove all of those nasty chemicals in the brain that make you mentally feeble. Now, the latest study of this was a study done on mice. This one's the most exciting. And they've extrapolated from the mice study. Here is the conjecture. 5 cups a day might reverse Alzheimer's. Now, it's got to be good coffee, though. No instant coffee. Now, people ask me about decaf all the time. I think decaf is like kissing your sister. Okay? It's okay, but you know, it's not quite the real. I like my sister, it's fine. I always give her a big kiss, but it's not quite the same thing, okay? So there are some things in decaf that are okay, but this is the stuff as far as I'm concerned. Now the exciting thing about all this is that you can do all three at once. So if you sit down, have a nice cup of coffee, and read a book in another language, The Fountain of Youth. Now, if anyone is considering doing research in this area, I volunteer my services as subject. All right? I did go to the doctor a month ago for my physical, and he told me that my blood type was Starbucks. Well, that's paper number 1. Thank you very much. Okay? Well, paper number 2, now we're getting to the handout, and I'm going to make brief comments in each of these areas. Part 1 is some definitions. Let's get things straight. Definitions according to my highly biased view of the world. According to the theory I've been working on for the last 35, 40 years with the help of my colleagues, some of whom are here today. And I'm going to define some terms in terms of theory, and I hope this will help our discussion a little bit. 2 fundamentally different approaches. One, my obsession since 1975, the comprehension hypothesis. This says, in case you haven't heard about this by now, we acquire language by understanding it, by understanding what people tell us, by understanding what we read. This is not my idea originally. I have simply been responsible for public relations. Before me, people like Frank Smith knew all about it in the field of literacy. Kenneth Goodman knew all about it before I started in. In fact, Smith had it years before I did, and he expressed it in such beautiful form. If you've read Reading Without Nonsense, you see, and when I discovered their work, it was wonderful. The same ideas, very clearly expressed from completely different sources of evidence, which gives you a lot of confidence in the ideas. In the field of second language acquisition, James Asher, TPR, was there before I was. He had most of these ideas in some form. A guy named Leonard Newmark knew all about this too. He was a professor in San Diego in foreign language. Now, I've mentioned Goodman, I mentioned Newmark, and I found out years later, and this is really weird. It's spooky, in fact. We're all probably related. Yetta Goodman and I, we found out by accident, our families come from the same tiny little village in Eastern Europe. And they left East as a village of 3,000 people, my dad's family and her dad's family. Yetta and I speak the same kind of Yiddish, the same hair. Is that amazing? And I'm always criticized in the same breath as Goodman. I'm very honored by that, okay? I think it's very nice. And then I found out that Leonard Newmark and I are married. Well, I ran into him. No, we're not. We're just friends. I'm actually straight, okay? We're actually kind of cousins. I ran into him at the 50th wedding anniversary of my aunt and uncle. And it turned out that he has the same aunt and uncle. So on my father's side, we're all the same. Is that weird? Yeah. So, okay. Getting back to this is the comprehension hypothesis. I think it's right. I think it's overwhelming evidence. The opposing hypothesis is that conscious learning becomes subconscious acquisition. You first learn a rule, practice it over and over again, it becomes more and more automatic. This was the foundation of the field called applied linguistics up until the middle 1970s. It said that what we were supposed to do, we university people, was to describe the rules carefully. People turned them into exercises, you practice them over and over again, etc., which I think is fundamentally incorrect. That's not how language is acquired. Underneath, here's where I think we can make some progress. There are 2 kinds of learning becomes acquisition models, 2 kinds of skill building, we call it. One is deductive. You tell people the rules, they go out and practice them. This is direct instruction, also called explicit instruction. Then there are 2 inductive. You've got to figure out the rule. One kind I call output plus correction. You say something, you make a mistake, someone corrects it, you change your idea of what the rule is. So the 6-year-old limited English child comes into the class and says to the teacher, or the ESL child comes into the class and says to the teacher, I comes to school every day. Teacher says, no, I come to school every day. The child is supposed to think, oh yeah, that S doesn't go on the first person singular, it goes on the third person singular. I think that's utter fantasy, but that's the idea. The second one, the second kind of inductive, is a recent player, only about 15 years old, called comprehensible output. This is the idea of Meryl Swain in Canada, who is a member of the Loyal Opposition. But Meryl says that this is one way to acquire language. Her followers, I think it's the only way. Here's how it works. You say something in another language, the other person doesn't understand you. Says, what? You try again. What are you talking about? Finally, you discover the right rule, and the person says, yes, now I understand. Okay, we'll come back to that. So both of these are inductive ways where you figure out the rule. I've listed on the sheet the need hypothesis, which is the average person's personal theory of language acquisition. I keep hearing politicians say this. We need to put people in situations where they must acquire the language. They need to acquire it, then they'll do it. This is total submersion, okay? A situation where you have to talk and you have to get feedback. A radio program in the United States called the Prairie Home Companion discussed this about 20 years ago, Garrison Keillor. It was called the Minnesota Language School. They did this bit. They say, we're going to teach this guy German, and we're going to use the need hypothesis. So they take this guy and they say, you're coming up with us in a helicopter without a parachute. And they put a gun to the guy's head and they say, if you don't start to speak German now, we're going to push you out of the helicopter. This is the need hypothesis. And the guy, of course, says, oh, jetzt kann ich sehr gut Deutsch sprechen, wie geht es Ihnen? No, cannot work, okay? Generally, the need hypothesis requires people to say something and get feedback, etc. Now, grammar instruction, contrary to popular opinion, I am not opposed to grammar instruction. I just think it's very limited. It can help here and there. It's not against the law. It's not, teach grammar, go to jail. All right? No, not at all. There is a role for it, and I've tried to distinguish several roles. One is as the monitor to edit what you're saying or writing, and that's hard to do. It's not impossible, but it's tough. Very severe conditions have to be met to do it. Second is as linguistics, to teach people about the structure of language, the wonderful work of Noam Chomsky, language change, dialects, all those things. A third way, and this is a theoretical possibility that has not been studied enough, using grammar to make input more comprehensible. Maybe. I kind of think it works with experts like us, who really are interested in the study of language, but I don't know if it works for normal people, okay? There are two ways of teaching grammar, and I'm nearly done with talk number one, as subject matter, of course, and this is usually for linguistics, and a new way of doing it, which I really like. There's a language teaching methodology spreading through the United States now called TPRS. Check it out. Go to Google and Google TPRS. I think it's really, really interesting. Yeah, good for you. Invented by a guy named Blaine Ray, who was very clever and very good language teacher. And he invented, it's used in high school language, he invented something called pop-up grammar, which I think is really neat. Pop-up grammar is very quick grammar explanations in the middle of the lesson, in the middle of the story. I've taken lots of TPR classes. If you go to their conferences, you can take their intensive class, 9 hours. And I remember once in the intermediate Spanish, my teacher, Jason Fritz, was doing a discussion, we were playing a game, and then he said, and he switched to English, he said, by the way, if you put an O at the end of the verb, it means past tense. Now, for some people like me who love grammar, that's linguistics. For other people, it might be making input more comprehensible. For still other people who are good at mental gymnastics, maybe they can monitor that. But the whole explanation took 3 seconds. I took a Mandarin class also, my 9 hours of Mandarin from Linda Lee, and in the middle she stopped and said in English, by the way, Mandarin doesn't use infinitives, we just string the verbs together. Linguistics for those who like it, quick, easy. I think this is an enormously good idea. Well, that's a few terms that we're going to be using as we proceed. Thank you very much. Talk number one. Thank you. Thank you. What I'm going to do is give you some very brief examples from drastically unrelated areas. And I'm doing this on purpose. I want them to be unrelated, distant areas, so you see this is a universal kind of conclusion. Conversational competence. Some of these are ordinary cases, and I think that's why they're important. I got a call from a reporter about 10 years ago from the Los Angeles Times. He says he was doing an article about immigrants who came to the United States to acquire English and started working in restaurants but acquired other languages instead. Or in addition. So he asked me to come to a restaurant in the Valley in California, in Los Angeles, to meet a guy named Armando. Armando came from Mexico to the United States when he was around 14 or so. He had been in the United States for 12 years, had a junior high school education, and had been working full-time in an Israeli restaurant. He acquired English. His English was good. His Hebrew was better. He told me how he did it. We had a nice conversation. Our first conversation was entirely in English, no problem at all. And I said, did you sounds a lot like a young lady who won the spelling competition. He said, did you study? He says, no, I just listened. Did you get any correction when you tried to speak? Yeah, but it was all vocabulary. Do you know the rules? I have no idea of what the rules are. Didn't read, did not want to be Jewish, did not want to go to Israel. He just liked his friends in the restaurant. He became very closely integrated with his friends. The young men his age, they were bonded very close. When he was in a traffic accident and in a local hospital, the restaurant came every day and brought him food and said prayers for him every day. So I got very interested and I asked him to sit around with his best friend, and I tape recorded this, and I said, have a conversation in Hebrew. Let's talk about what you did yesterday. Okay? So the two of them had a conversation. I occasionally interrupted and threw in something to push them in another direction. But it was fairly spontaneous. It would have been better if I had eavesdropped, okay? But you can't do that, so I didn't. So I recorded this casual conversation. The next day, I went to the Israeli embassy, the Israeli consulate in Los Angeles, and the Israeli tourist office. I played the tape for native speakers of Hebrew. One person thought Armando was a native speaker. Other people said, no, he's Ethiopian, but he's really good. Another one said, he's probably from Morocco. Now, the owners of the restaurant were Moroccan Jews, okay? The range was anywhere from pretty good to native. This is not uncommon. We see this is throughout the history of the human race. This is how people have acquired languages. So Armando's interesting because it wasn't the language of the country. It was his social group that he integrated into. Okay, some spectacular cases. Richard Boydell, the case of the longest silent period in history, 30 years. Richard Boydell describes his own case and says he grew up without any use of his arms, without any use of his legs. He had muscular dystrophy when he was very young. And he couldn't speak very much. He could only say yes and no. That was all that his parents understood. But his parents were very good to him. They talked to him, they talked to him, they talked to him. He started listening to the radio. He started watching television. He started reading. He started listening to conversations, understanding everything. At age 30, if you remember the movie My Left Foot, it's a very similar case. He was given an electric typewriter that he could operate with one toe. Within 1 week, he started producing elegant, beautiful prose. In other words, no output, no correction, no study of rules, all through comprehensible input. Academic language. The urge now is academic language, as we know. We're all obsessed with getting kids into academic language and, unfortunately, direct teaching. I think the evidence goes the other way, that the real route to academic language is free voluntary reading. I'll give you just one study out of many. Our colleague Beniko Mason in Japan did this wonderful paper last year. She had taught students using a method based on storytelling and free voluntary reading of graded readers, very popular. She asked 5 of her students if they'd like to do a study, self-study program. Now, this is already set up to succeed with students who are motivated, understand the methodology. If it fails here, then we're in big trouble, okay? So this is the first test. They decided they wanted to improve their scores on the TOEFL examination. All they did was read for pleasure. None of them were taking classes. None had any exposure to English. She documented their progress. They all read different things, okay? Some read graded readers, some read comic books, some read romance novels, etc. The average progress was 3.5 points per week on TOEFL, various internet varieties of TOEFL, and per hour, it was about the same you get if you spend lots of money, go to the United States, and go into an official TOEFL course. I think the implication is important for theory, and it is the kiss of death for the TOEFL preparation industry. I'm sorry. We have to go with what works. I'd rather the authors of graded readers make money on this and not the TOEFL prep books people, okay? So there. Vocabulary. There have been a lot of studies showing that when you read stories to children and older people, they get better and better, and their vocabulary gets better. Warwick Kelly's worked on this. I want to add to this one little area of research I just discovered, and I want to bring it to your attention because it's been going on for 15 years, and we don't know about it because it's all in medical journals. There's a very interesting program called Reach Out and Read. Have any of you heard of this? Very interesting. All you got to do is Google Reach Out and Read, and you get their website. Many studies. I've presented to you one that is typical of the others in the chart. In this study, as in others, it's aimed at families, usually English as a first language, but sometimes as a second language as well. It's aimed at families who are high poverty. They go to health clinics where they come in for yearly well-child checkups with a physician. Doesn't work in an emergency room. They've tried that. People are too busy. They're too freaked out when they go to emergency rooms, obviously. Took a research study to show them that. Unbelievable. Anyway, they went to these clinics. While they're in the waiting room, the mothers and the children, hospital staff talks to them about reading to kids and shows them how to do it and gives them some ideas of books. The physician says the same thing. It's backed up by the physician. They then give the family one book for free. Turns out something like 30% of all high poverty families have been exposed to Reach Out and Read. I didn't know anything about this, okay? What do the studies say? It works. The one I have here, the children, when they were tested, were 4 years old. They had been in Reach Out and Read for 3 years. The average family had 4 or 5 books. That's all. They tested them on vocabulary, passive vocabulary, active vocabulary, and as you see, they make a pretty good effort in closing the gap between them and middle-class families in terms of vocabulary for a treatment that costs next to nothing. At the same time, the United States government is wasting billions of dollars on expensive programs for children in preschool, kindergarten, testing them, giving standards, curriculum, when all they've got to do is something like this, and you get demonstrated results. So my suggestion is go to Google, look under Reach Out and Read. You'll see study after study that says the same thing. Another area which is a trend these days is phonemic awareness, and I'm bringing this up because the phonemic awareness disease is now spreading throughout Asia. It's spread throughout the United States, and phonemic awareness is pre-phonics. It's being able to take a word and divide it into its sounds. So in a typical phonemic, well, let's do some phonemic awareness, okay? I'll give you a word, and you tell me, you strip away the first sound, get rid of it, and tell me what's left, okay? Are you ready? Okay, pit. Good. Try this one. Split. Let me tell you what you just did. You spelled the word in your mind's eye, you took away the S, and then you pronounce what's left. Isn't that right? I've just demonstrated that phonemic awareness is the result of knowing how to read. It's not the cause. Everybody thinks it's the cause. So this is spreading, they're giving kids phonemic awareness, training. This idea of training always bothered me. Training little children. Not education, but training. The difference between training and education was explained to me by a colleague a few years ago. If your daughter goes to school and she comes home and says, they've had sex education, that's okay. But if she comes home and says, we had sex training, you kind of wonder what happened, okay? Anyway, so the word has always bothered me, okay? So what is one of the arguments against this idea of phonemic awareness, which I think is completely unnecessary, is that you develop phonemic awareness just by reading, just by growing up, without instruction. And the studies I've had here, I won't give you the details, are simply that when you have comparison groups, the groups that had no phonemic awareness get better nearly as much as the groups that had training. So it develops on its own. Spelling. So much time on spelling. Research going back to 1902 says if you look at children who have had no spelling instruction at all, they make the same gains as children who had spelling instruction. The best study is Oliver Corman is probably the best, 1902. Hamill, Larson, and McNutt was really a fun study. They looked at kids who had different spelling programs, starting in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, all that stuff. And then they looked to see how good they got over the years. Then they found a group of children with no spelling instruction at all. The ones who had instruction were better in the beginning, but by the time they got to the 4th and 5th grade, no difference. How about that? All that time, for what? Text structure is the last one. This is also part of academic language, and this is the idea which the US government thinks is terrific, is that we'll explain story grammars to children. How plots go, protagonist, antagonist, problem resolution. We'll do the same thing with different genres, and that'll help people read and write. It has never been demonstrated to be true, ever. To me, it's a fantasy. And no one has ever even tested if it's necessary, but we do have little hints. For example, in one study, Spiegel and Fitzgerald, they said this kind of in passing, the older children have better developed story grammars. I wonder how that happened. They've never been taught. Maybe they get it through stories. What an interesting idea. And great writers tell you they became great writers not through study of grammar and text structure. Richard Wright, the author of a wonderful book, Black Boy, autobiography. I bought English grammars and found them dull. I felt I was getting a better sense of the language from novels than from grammars, of course. Well, we'll skip the applause because number 3 is short. The next paper is simply the scarcity argument, and this one is trouble for all the inductive skill-building approaches. Output plus correction, comprehensible output, because people don't talk that much. People don't write that much. For this to play any role at all, output has to be a lot more frequent than it is. I have looked at all the literature on comprehensible output that I could find, and these are cases where you say something, the other person doesn't understand, and then you reformulate. And most studies, it's barely there at all, maybe 1 an hour. Of course, the criticism on this, the response is, yeah, but you can contrive these situations. We can have them do these jigsaw task activities where they have to talk more and they'll make more mistakes and they'll have more communicative problems and then it'll be more frequent. Well, still it isn't that frequent. It's like 2 a minute maybe. That's not enough. But also, if it only works under a contrived laboratory situation, it cannot help ordinary people very much. Okay, that's number 2 and number 3. Let's go on to number 4, complexity. Thank you. All skill-building hypotheses that are strong versions, this is like overkill, okay? The complexity argument wipes them out. The system is too complicated. You can't come close. Vocabulary, an article I recommend everybody in the Canadian Review of Applied Linguistics. This is Paul Nation's work. The number of words you need to have, or that people get, is too many. You can't do them one at a time. Native speakers, 20,000 word families, all right? Highly educated non-native speakers, 8,000 to 9,000 word families. I wrote Paul Nation last month about this one. I said, Have you done studies, more studies on really well-educated, highly proficient second language English users like most of you people? And I said, I would like to compare their vocabulary size to that of George W. Bush. I think it won't even be close, okay? He says, no, we haven't quite gotten that far yet in the research, okay? So if people know 20,000 word families and, total, 50,000 words total, that's not 20,000 flashcards. It's not 20,000 trips to the dictionary, et cetera. Vocabulary is also enormously complicated. If you've read Ken Hyland's research, just the descriptions of the subtleties of various words and vocabulary is hard for us to understand. How are our students ever going to do it? Phonics. Phonics is enormously difficult once you get beyond the basics, initial consonants. Frank Smith's very simple example. Take H-O. In each of these words, H-O is pronounced differently. Hope, hot, hook, hour, honest, house, honey, hoist, horse, horizon. What's the rule? And to do it, you've got to know the whole word and then go backwards. I mean, these are really hard. I've also noticed that people who've tried to simplify the rules come up with even more complicated versions. Spelling, the great study on spelling done by Vivian Cook in 1912, 99 years ago. He took students who had just studied rules in high school or college on spelling rules, I before E except after C and all this stuff. And he gave them a spelling test that used the rules. First of all, some students didn't remember the rules. Some people remembered them but didn't use them. Some people remembered them and used them. There was no difference in how well they spelled, and most of the students couldn't remember the rules. In fact, they used much simpler, they couldn't remember I before E. Remember that? Except April, July, and August, which has 31 days. I don't know, I get it all worked. And they would give a much simpler version. Okay, part 5, and we just have another 2.5 hours to go. Okay. Clara, give me another warning in 5 minutes, okay? Okay. Multivariate studies are wonderful. I remember the day I finally understood multiple regression. 20 years ago, I dreamed about it. And I realized that multivariate analysis was what we'd been looking for years and years. I'll introduce it by directing your attention to the little tables. In a study done by Harry Grodman and Edith Hanania, published in the Modern Language Journal, 1991, they looked at predictors of TOEFL. And they looked at various independent predictors. How much reading you did, whether you had a native speaker teacher, how much instruction in English, how much talking you did. The column called beta is the strength of each predictor relative to the others, with each one artificially held constant. Like, let's say total instruction and reading should probably correlate. People have gone to class more, have probably read more. This pretends it's not true. So each one is equal weight. The winner, easily reading. Native speaker teacher was positive here, but I don't know why, frankly. That's a mystery to me. Total, a lot of you think it must be true, I'm sure. Total instruction, negative. The more study, the worse. The more speaking, the worse. Wow. Similar results from our study, and this is Dr. Kyung-Suk Cho, who's the Cho here, sitting in the second row here. We did back in 97. This one, everything worked, including free reading, study, how long you were in the United States. Seeing Lee's paper, I did not put in a chart because it's a more complex multivariate analysis called structural equation modeling, looking at students' writing proficiency in English as a second language in Taiwan. Those who read more did better. Those who wrote more did not do better. And those who thought instruction was very important did not do any better. Finally, the one I started on with this one, 1998, my first look into the Spanish subjunctive, which is always this problem, and they spend so much time on it in class. The second language students who were better in the Spanish subjunctive, study of Spanish didn't count, how long you lived in Spanish-speaking countries didn't count, how long you'd studied the subjunctive itself didn't count, free voluntary reading was the winner. In all these studies, if you look at it together, free voluntary reading defeats the competing hypotheses. in nearly every case. It never loses. At worst, it ties. It nearly always wins. Now, some people think conscious learning works, and articles have been appearing since the 1990s that this is true. I take credit for this entire line of research. I'm very proud this is happening. And I suspect this is a reaction to some of the claims I've made. And what I'm proud of is the fact that what used to be an axiom is now a hypothesis. At least they're trying to show that it's true. When it seems to work, one of the following is always true. Number one, the conditions for monitor use have been met, and the results are very small. Also, you have to look at the comparison group. Usually it's compared to doing nothing. So we found that grammar instruction is better than nothing, or some other form of grammar instruction. Finally, you look closer and you see that in every case there was comprehensible input. One example, and there's lots of these, master's study, 1994. I picked this out because it's interesting for several reasons. The subjects were the best language students you can find anywhere. These are international students coming to the United States to study at American universities. These are people who do things like electrical engineering, systems analysis, advanced calculus. They're not afraid of analytic analysis. They've studied English in their own country for years. They expect grammar, and they kind of like it. The object of study here was the definite and indefinite article, which they knew about since they were 10 years old. It's very hard to study English without coming across the definite or indefinite article, okay? They got 6 hours of heavy study of the article, enough to drive anyone crazy, in my opinion. Here are the gains. As you see on the chart, one group gained 6.5% compared to 2%. Another group, 9% compared to 1%. This was declared a major victory for grammar. What it shows is that the influence of grammar teaching in this case is pathetic. How would you feel? You're a teacher in a class. You're doing grammar teaching. You give your kids 6 hours of instruction on the definite article, and they increase 6.5%. They go like from a C+ to a B-. You would be very frustrated, yet this is declared a victory. And the students were focused on grammar the entire time. The conditions for monitor use were met. This confirms that grammar teaching is highly limited. I'll jump down to text structure. Text structure, when it seems to work in a couple of cases, has been compared to other forms of direct teaching or doing nothing at all. The one time when it was compared to authentic reading and writing, those who did more reading and writing did better, and I think it was the reading that counted. Well, also when we look at cases of people they claim have done this all through direct instruction, I was criticized by a scholar, I won't mention any names, it's Horner. He said, well, a counterexample to all of Krashen's outrageous arguments are people like Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich Schliemann was this archaeologist who claimed to have discovered the missing city of Troy, okay? Did you see the movie, Troy? Brad Pitt as Achilles? I thought he was really good. It's a good movie. The parts they kind of missed, but we'll talk about that later. Anyway, Schliemann, the idea was learned English, and he did acquire English very well, we know that, by self-study alone. All he did was write sentences, have them corrected, and then memorize the corrected sentences. Well, I had some time off being a college professor, and I decided, you think we understand your problems? You have no idea. What an easy life. Oh, university. At a research university, I mean. Gosh, was it simple. Anyway, so I went to the library, and the first book I found was a collection called The Psychopathology of Heinrich Schliemann. Turns out all we know about Schliemann's method is what Schliemann said about Schliemann, and these people thought he was a complete liar. Nevertheless, I read Schliemann's book, and I decided to, let's pretend it's true. He got a lot of comprehensible input. He had a lesson in English every day. He read books out loud in English all the time. He went to 2 church sermons every week, and he claimed, don't let the Ministry of Education know this, he claimed he memorized Ivanhoe and the Vicar of Wakefield. Can you see this as a requirement coming down? Yes, we'll have our students memorize these things. No. One scholar who looked at his case said he pumped in the equivalent of 7 years of formal study in English. Something's right, I think, something's wrong, but he studied English every spare moment. He did a lot more than write out sentences and get them corrected. Now, there is one case of someone who has done it through grammar. Actually, a combination of grammar and language acquisition. This is the case of Daniel Tammet. Now, Daniel Tammet was on TV in a European special and claimed to learn Icelandic in 10 days. They set him a task, learned Icelandic, he studied it, and 10 days later he was able to have free conversations with native speakers of Icelandic on TV with witnesses. He did some acquisition, did some reading, but also did a lot of grammar. I read his autobiography. It's called Born on a Blue Day. Daniel Tammet has a form of autism called the savant syndrome. He has an unbelievable analytic ability and memory. He holds the British and European record for memorizing pi. He memorized pi to 22,514 digits. It took him 5 hours to recite it. He did it as publicity to raise money for charity. By the way, the world record holder lives in China, and the world record is about 60,000. If you want fame and glory, all you have to do is memorize pi to 20 digits. And there's a website. And if you can get a witness, 3.14159263589794386. Did you get that? Okay. You can get on that website. But this is what it takes to do conscious grammar. You want to do conscious grammar, you should have savant syndrome. Then you've got a chance. But for the rest of it, it's not going to help. Finally, people have talked about, I'll skip 7, talked about combining these things. Maybe comprehensible inputs is okay, but it's not enough. We've got to stimulate what works with what doesn't work in order to make kids go all the way. I'll make just 2 comments and I'll stop. The original claim comes from Canadian immersion. And some of you may have read about this, Meryl Swain's research. You look at kids who've been in immersion and they're pretty good, but they're not perfect. And they should be perfect after 7 years. We need more talking and we need more grammar because they're not doing enough of each. I wrote a paper on this and said, number one, if you look at them over the long term, they keep getting better. They don't stop. It's slow, but they keep getting better. Number two, they have a problem getting enough comprehensible input. They're getting class activities in French, same thing over and over again. They don't interact socially with native speakers. No attempt at free voluntary reading. What do they read? They read Judy Blume. They read everything in English, okay? My request to the immersion people is at least try free voluntary reading. Nope, we're gonna do grammar. This is the answer. The other claim comes from our colleagues who say our goal is academic language. Free voluntary reading is not enough. It will not give you everything you need. And my conclusion from the research is free voluntary reading, that's a notice for you to pay attention to this next sentence. Free voluntary reading will not give you everything, but it will make academic texts much more comprehensible. It will bring you to the threshold. If you have 2 students at the university and they both need to read technical texts, and one has read Harry Potter, Twilight, all the other modern classics, okay? And has read all the vampire novels, etc. The discourses are not identical, but there's enough overlap so the academic texts are far more comprehensible. So I think it has been the missing link. I will continue exactly this discussion tomorrow when I talk about libraries and reading. Thank you for allowing me to go over a few minutes. Thanks again, Clara.